Hello and welcome to Tete by Fresco Media. We're here today for a second episode in the build up to the Indian Super League, which starts on November the 20th. And joining us on this one is Dibidi Bhattacharya, who has taken a lot of inspiration from the wingmen, Robertson and Trent Alexander-Arnold. He's joining us from his car.
It's a pretty good setup, pretty cozy setup. I see why they keep going for podcasts in the cars.
Inadvertently, you've blocked out the noise. That's terrific. I'm here, I'm stuck with firecrackers bursting in the background on the occasion of Diwali. So that's a good setup you've chosen there. Already bonus points to you. But we're going to speak about something that both of us are very excited to speak about because for the longest time, Indian football and financial struggles have gone hand in hand. And a lot of people know that Indian football is not necessarily the biggest sport in the country, right? It's one of them um, kind of sleeping giants, if I may call it. And FIFA themselves have come out tens and millions of times have branded India the sleeping giant of football. We're yet to see where that plan is going towards. But the ISL was launched to bring sustainability or financial sustainability to Indian football clubs. And this started off with a franchisee based model. But they also introduced a lot of things that's very similar to the Indian Premier League, which is the cricket league of the country. And one of them was the central revenue pool, which basically means that each club gets a share of the revenue generated from sponsorship and broadcasting. And surprise, surprise, this revenue that each club earns is offset by a franchise fee that each club needs to pay before every season, which baffles me because you're essentially stepping into the season on the back foot.
Absolutely, because of this arrangement of where the central revenue pool from which the clubs are getting the money after the competition's over is far lesser than the franchisee fee that they are paying, makes a very unsustainable model at the very beginning. And to everybody's surprise, FSDL is the only entity in 5 and 6 years to be making profits, rather than any club who haven't even come close to breaking even. So it obviously makes people become skeptic and question the ambition and of the FSDL. Are they here to really make football finance in India sustainable, make clubs operational, and not and be in competition for a long, long time, or is the trend of clubs shutting shop in 2-3 years going to keep continue?
We've
Right?
already
And
seen we've already seen right with Delhi Dynamos shifting base because of huge costs in renting the Nehru Stadium in Delhi. We've seen a lot of owners moving in and out, and that's a concern. But also, on the other hand, the source of revenue is so limited because you don't see, other than three or four clubs, you don't see fans thronging the stadium during games. We've seen a lot of empty stands over the few years, and even things like merchandise revenue and things associated with match day income is very, very severely restricted because of the lack of interest, you might say. Does that play a big part in clubs trying to break this threshold of finding new avenues, or should they still explore these particular, these channels and revenues that are very popular in Europe and across the world?
don't you think the big mistake that the FSDL and the AIFF have made is creating this anomaly that the ISL is, because of the fact that they have created new sporting entities and ignored the established clubs that have been in existence and have had fans and a legacy along with them, makes it much harder for ISL to get fans and get people to watch the league. They've already started off in a back foot. So I think that's where, in terms of broadcasting, they are really well and truly behind than the IPL, because IPL essentially is an entertainment for 3 months, while the ISL's ambition was not to be entertainment but to be the top flight football league in India.
Well, wasn't it started off, we remember the first 2-3 years where it was just a 3 month tournament, just like the IPL, but you had probably retired or, superstars or veterans coming to the end of their careers, coming for a payday in the ISL to also help the ISL boost its valuation initially. Now, I want to compare that to the MLS because I see a lot of similarities. There are differences, of course, but the MLS themselves, when they started off, you had the likes of, not Pele because he came in before the MLS, but I remember David Beckham wasn't exactly at his end of his career, but he offered some years after its prime. even Zlatan Ibrahimovic, you have Carlos Vela, you have Matuidi, you have Higuain today. These are, world class players in their own right and back in the day, but they're representing clubs that, don't really have history. The MLS themselves was formed in 1996. Inter Miami, which has got Matuidi and Higuain on the payroll, launched last season. So the MLS has a lot of similarity, doesn't it, to the ISL?
Absolutely, and that similarity has impacted the ISL also. I think in the very few in the beginning of the ISL, when it started, it really garnered a lot of viewership from not only in India but from around the world, and it's one of the most watched leagues in the world. I think it was the fourth or fifth most watched league in the world, which is great because people are wanting to watch the ISL, and obviously with how the superstars have thronged the ISL over the years, it is also a place where players want to come and play, which is great. But the difference here between the ISL and the MLS clubs financially is the MLS clubs have been able to tap the areas of income that the ISL clubs haven't been able to because of the non-existence of the merchandise market. There's no shirt sales, and which is a very big source of income for clubs around the world, including in the MLS. And along with them, the transfer fee, because as we see in India, the transfer fees are almost non-existent. Players are signed either as free agents or get loaned, which is very different than in Europe and in MLS, where you see the MLS exporting talents to even Europe. Miguel Almiron coming to Newcastle, Alfonso Davis from Canada, Tyler Adams. So obviously, you can see that a lot of these MLS clubs are tapping into the sources of revenue uh, that the ISL clubs are failing to. Inter Miami's first thing they did once they got the franchisee or the club is to make their own stadium, something that ISL clubs are really struggling to do. And some clubs shifting bases because of the same reason. So these financial factors are extremely important. And coming to the MLS also, since they also haven't been able to churn out profits after 20 years, does it really paint a pretty picture for the ISL in their future?
Yeah, I think if you put it as a direct comparison and you look at the MLS trajectory, you can say that it might not be the most promising land for Indian Super League clubs, but I see the MLS as a different proposition to the ISL because, I mean, finally FSTL have acknowledged that there are historic traditions in Indian football, there are hotspots, and they're trying to tap into that, which I appreciate. But also, I think they need to give these clubs and these assets, as you may call it, in Mohun Bagan, you might say East Bengal, of course. They need to give them the platform to excel and grow because these clubs have a 100-year history in the sport, and you cannot deny that, especially in a league that is only 6 years old. But also, the MLS is different in the sense that it has an owner-investor model, and by this I mean that each owner of a club is not solely owning their club. They just like how investment works. These owners invest in the league, so they have a stake in the MLS, and in return they get the club as asset, you might say, that brings them revenue. So that is an interesting way because at the end of the day, the MLS wants to bring more and more people into stadiums and wants to watch the games on TV. They have big television deals that they've struck with local broadcasters. And this is all an attempt to woo investors and also to bring up the valuation, just like a company would. And I think that is the promising sign for the MLS because they seek to eventually get to a point where each club breaks even, while the ISL is very, very far away from it. Even with recent improvements, it seems a long, long time away.
I think one of the key words that you used in describing the MLS is the owners or the investors get clubs as assets, right? And here the word club is far less used when ISL teams are much more of a franchisee. And here the AFC licensing criteria is extremely important. Where do you stand and where do you see these clubs who are still struggling to get the AFC licensing criteria or they get certified by the AFC, playing their part and playing its part in making football or clubs much more sustainable in the long term?
Yeah, I think you're coming to mention the nitty gritty of the AFC licensing criteria, but one thing that it does is that it makes franchisees turn to clubs, and one of the biggest importance of that is that the clubs or the franchisees rather initially have to make sure that they have a youth setup and also have their own infrastructure. And that is something that's prevalent across the world. Think of a successful football club. They always have their own facilities. But I think you'll come to mention that some of the clubs, have failed this criteria test, and that places a significant burden on the ISL, the FSTL as well, because with Indian Super League having three slots in Asian competition, you have one slot for Asian Champions League, which is a historic first in Indian football, and two slots in the FC Cup. We only get to see 5 or 6 clubs being represented because of the fact that only 5 or 6 clubs have passed this criteria and can actually participate in these competitions. So that severely restricts the other half of the ISL clubs from even participating in these tournaments.
Exactly, I think representation into Asia is extremely important, which is one of the reasons why the AFC criteria, licensing criteria, is extremely important for clubs to adhere to. But what it also does, as you mentioned, is it guarantees longevity. A club which has which like the AFC criteria dictates, clubs need to have age group teams, at least three age group teams in their ranks. It can be under 30, under 15, under 19s. It's up to them. They need a stadium facility which is up to the AFC standards with a certain capacity. They need an AFC A licensed coach, which is obviously going to guarantee you good football, good knowledge from the coach that he's going to impart onto the players. It's also includes independent auditing, which is going to look after your finances as a club, if it's which is also important because clubs in India have a tradition to shut up shop in 3 years. So these criterias are important into turning franchises into clubs, and guaranteeing longevity, which is important. But at the same time, is it too early for clubs to adhere to these things when they are at this kind of an initial stage of growth?
That's a crucial question. That's a crucial point. In terms of stadiums, infrastructure, and youth development, I mean, just shelling out the expenses, you're just looking at the balance of accounts. And if you're already on the back foot heading into the season when your franchise fee is offsetting your base revenue from the central pool, and then you have to pay player salaries from that revenue, which is already restricted. And there have been reports that clubs were spending 90% of the revenue on player salaries in the first 2 or 3 years, and that's thankfully come down to 65-70%, but that's still a very high number when you ideally want it to be 50% salaries and 50% everything else. That severely restricts a club from investing in the future. Only a couple of clubs at the top of my head have actually produced talents in the last 4 or 5 years that have broken through from their own academy to the first team. FC Goa have done it, and Mumbai City are trying to do it again. Bengaluru FC have done it, but I think that is where the ISL and the FSTL and the clubs need to sit together and devise a plan, because if you're going to restrict the revenue streams and also charge them a huge franchise fee that limits their spending, it is impossible for these teams to even think about it, setting up a stadium, setting up a youth academy across 3 age groups like you mentioned. It's a very, very big task, and this requires a lot of commitment from the owners, who themselves, we don't know whether they're invested for the long term. We've seen a lot of revolving doors, really. These are all big talking points in Indian football, and these have not just like problems today. These have been problems that have engulfed the scene for the last 20-25 years, and hopefully we're expecting a merger to happen. And the merger is kind of the big event in the timeline of Indian football, because we think, or we hope, that these clubs will sit down and come to a reasonable plan to make it sustainable to operate at the highest level in Indian football. But at this point, it seems like if I were an owner, I would not prioritize getting a stadium and prioritizing youth development, and would therefore forego the opportunity to play in Asia if I qualify.
The ISL and the I League are looking to merge in the coming future, and this merger that has been in the pipeline is going to determine the longevity of Indian football and Indian football clubs. Because what is happening right now, due to clubs being franchisees and not looking at a long term, it is creating a monopoly of 3 or 4 clubs who are becoming the big 3 or big 4 or big 5 in the ISL, where the other clubs are just making up the numbers. And if you look through to the ISL teams, you will see that ISL teams are not producing players, they're buying players from the I League club. So this merger, when it happens, it's going to make I League clubs have much more incentive of not just selling their talents to the ISL teams and keeping them with them so that they are competing with the ISL teams on the same front for the same position in the same league, which is going to make the ISL teams focus much more on their young talent so that they have their own factories of players to keep bolstering their squads, which is essential into keeping the competition going in a league, which is happening everywhere across the world, which is why the merger is so much more important. And it will create, and what it will create a market for transfer fees, because money will become extremely important for smaller clubs, which the bigger clubs like the ATKs, the Mumbai cities can afford to spend, and it will create a much more sustainable model for clubs to become feeders and at the same time be sustainable in their operations through these financial gains that they'll get by selling their good players. Do you think this is a way forward for the I League and the ISL to merge?
I think they have to merge at some point, but I would rather wait till a a well thought out plan comes into place, because just by merging at the moment, we're seeing a lot of I League clubs going bust, a lot of I League clubs struggling to stay afloat, and there's no real market, like you mentioned. There's no real marketplace for player sales, and that forms a significant amount of revenue for a lot of the lower division sides across the world. And by not having this kind of a setup where players are on revolving contracts every year, most of the players at least are on 1 year contracts. They keep moving as free agents. This doesn't allow a club to even think about setting up a youth academy and trying to gamble on future prospects being developed. Tata Academy, which is one of the most prominent academies in the last 20, 30 years in India, is now feeding Jamshedpur FC, which Tata owns as well. And, academies like Minerva's Academy, which is one of the most acclaimed academies in the country, had a club. Minerva Punjab was a successful I League club, but have since, sold to a different investor because there's just no scope for an I League club to operate at this level. So the merger is an interesting one. I don't think it needs to come soon. It needs to happen at some point, but I would prefer to wait it out and see what they exactly come to, because FSTL, we don't know what their vision is for the future. We've never heard from the chairperson Nita Ambani, or even the CEO Sundaraman, about what their vision is for the future. We don't know whether they're actually going to help develop Indian football from the grassroots, which they've mentioned on 10,000 promotional videos. We haven't seen a single prospect being developed. We've only seen talents jump ship from the I League to the ISL, and that does not represent youth academies or grassroots being developed across ISL. And I think that is one source of revenue that is untapped, just like we're going to come on to mention broadcast and merchandise revenue. And I just want to first start off with broadcast revenue, because the ISL is so much different to the other leagues in the world, in the sense that Star Sports, which is a broadcaster of the league, is a partner of the league, not essentially an independent broadcaster. So then their interests are pretty aligned with FSTL, isn't it? It's just to make money.
And it creates a lot more problems than it gives to the teams, doesn't it? Because you look across broadcasting as a way of revenue, or as a stream of revenue across the world, and you see that Sky is spending a lot of more money wanting to show the Premier League games, or the other league games being broadcasted through now streaming platforms in Amazon and Hotstar and every other streaming platform that there is. So at the same time, Star being a partner in the league is kind of not the best idea for clubs to benefit from broadcasting, because they are not getting the kind of money that other broadcasters would be willing to pay to show the ISL games, because the ISL is popular, and just on the basis of the population in India, it can get a lot of viewership, and which is again another stream of income that remains untapped, which is something that they must come in the middle ground and find a solution to. Do you see a solution here, or do you see there's any way where the teams get the kind of broadcasting money that they deserve?
I hope they do. I actually hope that FSTL and Star Sports, funnily enough, back out, because I think the property that they've created, fair play to them, they've created a property that's quite exciting and that has engaged a lot of fans that they have no clue about Indian football really, and have followed their local teams or even another team for the last 6 to 7 years. And now they've even brought upon the two biggest names in Indian football, in ATK Mohun Bagan and East Bengal. But I think it's a lost cause there, because that if there's money in it, they're not going to back out from it. Why would they back out when they're making money? But on that note, that is a significant blow for the other clubs, because broadcasting is the majority of any income stream, and at least in sport, and that's a big blow. But another one that the clubs need to find a solution to is merchandising, because for the longest time, merchandising as a marketplace has not been existent really in Indian sport. At the top of my head, I can remember the Indian Premier League failed to have any sort of a merchandise market. We had manufacturers like Nike, Reebok, Adidas, and Puma, representing teams in the first year. But it's just the fact that the market isn't as big as it is in Europe, in terms of kit sales and merchandise sales. That just, shoos away this kind of an opportunity. And that's a shame, because this is something that can offset the lack of match day revenue, so to speak. And I really hope there is some kind of a plan that can actually get or tap into this untapped market.
I actually blame clubs for this untapped market for merchandise than I blame Adidas and Nike or the big kit manufacturers to not meet the price point at which Indian market becomes profitable for them. Because why would a company that sells at a higher price lower their price to lower the valuation? I don't think the Adidas kit manufacturers like Adidas and Nike are willing to do that. But I think clubs here are extremely at fault, because they are not. I don't see clubs encouraging kit sales as much as they are done outside India, in Europe, in America, and during the MLS, or even in China. Because kit manufacturers can be anything. Look at 656, who have taken over the Indian football team, and a few clubs in the ISL. And they have a website, and that's about it. I don't see marketing from 656 to promote these jersey sales, because they do meet a price point at which it becomes affordable for the Indian fans to buy kits. And I think any other kit manufacturing company needs to work on this marketing, because I don't see club stores. There are very few club stores operating in Indian football clubs. So where do the people go to buy these jerseys, which are original? So
I think there's actually one thing. There's actually an important thing, because the ISL or FSTL controls the merchandise market. Apart from the first team and for home and away kits, clubs can't sell their own merchandise. It has to go through ISL, which is why the ISL has their own merchandise site, which has generic t-shirts and merchandise collections for each club, which is kind of funny, because again, you're trying to restrict the revenue sources for these clubs. Quite funny.
And it brings back the question that why is FSDL the only entity in the ISL who's making profit while everybody else around them are struggling to? And it kind of facilitates the skepticism associated with FSDL. But again, for clubs, attracting sponsors should not only be restricted to merchandise. It can be in different forms. It can be selling naming rights to their stadium and their training complexes, which is a very popular way outside India. In training complexes of United, of Liverpool, stadium naming rights of Juventus, of Bayern Munich are sold to corporate companies, to their sponsors, to make use of their visibility and make it a marketing. From a marketing point of view, it's much more sustainable and much more gives an opportunity for them to market it in a better way. Because maybe you're wearing a fake jersey, but when you're walking into a stadium, you're seeing the name lit up, and it's hard to ignore. So I think there's a lot of way in which Indian clubs can still attract sponsors, which will be very, very essential for Indian clubs to survive from a financial standpoint.
I think the order of the day is that clubs need to get a little bit more creative, I think, with their efforts to bring in more revenue, whether it be through sponsorship, naming rights, merchandise, and so on. And we hope to see that, because at this point, it's almost like a fight between the clubs and FSTL. I mean, it's almost like a lost fight, because FSTL controls so much of the league that it is impossible to even think in different directions. But we hope that there is some point of truce between the parties and they come to something big, which we think is the merger, but we hope that day comes sooner rather than later. But until then, I think it's a debate for another day. We'll look to see what happens in the future in this space. And we're going to focus on something that's a little bit related to this topic, actually. It's the European collaborations with Indian football clubs. We've seen FC Goa tie up with RB Leipzig recently, and Hyderabad FC have a partnership with Borussia Dortmund. And there are many more partnerships over the years that we've seen either die out or blossom into successful ones. So hope you join us for that one, and I hope you like this one as well. If you have any thoughts or opinions, please give us your thoughts in the comments, or leave us a like, subscribe, do the good things. and we hope to entertain you soon. So until then, it's goodbye from us.